Griswold, Connecticut, 1990. Three boys playing in a gravel pit found something they couldn't have expected: a human skull. When police got involved, they found a burial plot full of what they assumed at first were serial killer victims, but that was not the case. 29 people had been buried in this old family cemetery. Most of the burials were typical of the 1830s, when they were thought to have died, but one was different. The man was called J.B. due to the tacks spelling out those initials on his coffin. When J.B. first died, his burial was probably a normal one. But 5 years after his death, someone reopened his coffin, broke several of his bones, decapitated him, and rearranged his body in a skull and crossbones. Police were stumped. Why had JB's body been desecrated like this so many years after his death? As it turned out, JB was just one in a potential line of people thought to be one of the most well-known paranormal creatures, vampires. According to folklorist Michael Bell, there were dozens of so-called anti-vampire rituals in New England in the 1700s and 1800s. Here are just a few of the documented cases where a deceased individual was thought to rise from their grave to feed on the living. Not much is known about Rachel Burton's early life. We know she was married to a Captain Israel Burton, and she died in 1790. About a year later, Captain Burton remarried a woman named Huldah Powell, but it wasn't long before his new wife got sick with the same illness that had taken Rachel. People started to wonder if Rachel was a vampire, draining the life out of her husband's new love. 2 years after her death, Rachel's body was exhumed. What little was left of her liver, heart, and lungs was removed and burned on a blacksmith's forge. However, it didn't work, and Huldah Powell died the following year. A marker was dedicated to Rachel's story in 2022 and sits at the entrance to the cemetery where she's buried. Bristow Congdon was a man who lived in Rhode Island in the 1800s. During this period, he and several of his children got sick and died. One of the children was exhumed and parts of their body burned. Not much else is publicly available on this case. Just like the Congdon family, not much is known about Annie Dennett. We do know that she died at the age of 21 in New Hampshire. Her body was exhumed in September 1810 in an attempt to save her father, who suffered from the same illness that had claimed her. When her grave was opened, it was discovered that she had almost fully decomposed. This is similar to JB's grave. Archaeologists believe his body was rearranged after his death because there was no soft tissue left to burn to kill the vampire. However, it's not clear if this happened in Annie's case. In 1817, Frederick Ransom was a student at Dartmouth College and came from a well-respected family in South Woodstock, Vermont. But when he died that year at the age of 20, his parents somehow got swept up in the vampire panic. Several members of his family suffered from the same illness that took his life, and they wondered if this disease was not only hereditary, but could be stopped by these rituals. Frederick's father had his body exhumed and his heart burned in a blacksmith's forge. However, it didn't work. His mother, sister, and 2 of his brothers still died afterward. Frederick's brother, Daniel, who was just 3 years old when Frederick died, grew up worrying that he would succumb to the so-called family illness. However, he later wrote about the incident in his memoirs when he was well into his 80s. A resident of Foster, Rhode Island, Nancy Young got sick and died in the early 1800s. In 1827, when her sister began exhibiting the same symptoms, Nancy's body was exhumed and burned, the smoke inhaled as a presumed cure. Not much else is publicly available on this case. In the summer of 1830, a boy only known by his last name, Corwin, died. 6 months later, one of his brothers also began showing symptoms of the same illness. The dead brother's body was exhumed, but his heart was still reportedly filled with blood, something that isn't supposed to happen so long after death. This anti-vampire ritual was even more over the top than others. After the boy's body was exhumed from Cushing Cemetery, his heart was removed and boiled in a pot. Then his remains were reinterred in a hole in the village green and covered with a 7-ton block of granite. Finally, the site was sprinkled with the blood of a young bullock. Simon Whipple Aldrich was born into a prominent Rhode Island family in 1814. He died in 1841 at the age of 27. While there are no records of anti-vampire rituals after his death, his headstone bears a strange inscription. Although consumption's vampire grasp had seized thy mortal frame, thy ardent and inspiring mind, untouched, remained the same. Between the years of 1844 and 1852, 3 members of the Ray family in Jewett City, Connecticut, got sick and died. Family patriarch Horace Ray was first, followed by 2 of his 5 children. In 1854, when a 3rd child also became ill, the bodies of the deceased sons were exhumed and burned, in a fear that they were vampires. In 1889, 19-year-old Nellie Vaughn died. Her case became notorious, causing her headstone to be vandalized and even broken. The stone was reportedly later removed due to the vandalism. The last documented case of anti-vampire rituals in New England was probably also the most well-known. Mercy Lena Brown, who reportedly went by Lena, lived with her family in Exeter, Rhode Island. But like many families in this story, the Browns were plagued by illness. Lena's mom died first in 1883, followed by her sister in 1884. Then her brother Edwin started getting sick and later traveled to Colorado, hoping the climate there would improve his health. Lena didn't start showing the same symptoms until almost a decade later, and died in January of 1892. Her brother's condition started to worsen while Lena was on her deathbed, even though he was still over 1,000 miles away. By this time, vampire legends had been making the rounds in New England. Neighbors of the Browns wondered if there was some unseen force preying on the family. If this force was destroyed, then maybe at least Lena's brother Edwin could be spared. So, with permission from her father George, the bodies of Lena, her mother, and her sister were exhumed on March 17, 1892. The latter of the 2 were now fully decomposed, but Lena looked almost exactly the same. She must be a vampire, rising from her grave to feed on her living family members, draining the life from them and taking it for herself. Lena's heart and liver were removed from her body and buried nearby. Edwin was given her ashes to drink as a cure, but it didn't work. He died in May of that year. There has been speculation that Mercy Lena Brown's case was the inspiration behind Dracula, though that's never been proven. So what happened here? Did vampires really invade New England in the 17 and 1800s? As it turns out, the truth reveals another, much different epidemic than what was originally believed. Tuberculosis is an infection that mainly affects the lungs. It's highly contagious and usually spread when a person with it coughs or sneezes near someone. Symptoms can last weeks, months, or even years after the initial infection. Before the advent of modern medicine, tuberculosis was virtually a death sentence. By Lena Brown's time, it accounted for nearly 25% of all deaths. According to Michael Bell, a person could live a normal life with little evidence of disease right up to the final months or even weeks. Out of sight, the disease often worked slowly, yet inexorably, to destroy its host over a period of years, alarming observers at the apparent swiftness of its course when it finally became manifest. Bell also said the disease progressed in such a way that it seemed like something was draining the life and blood out of somebody. Because tuberculosis is so contagious, it was often passed from one family member to another, and to another. When it wiped out an entire family, as it nearly did with the Browns, it could be concluded that one person was a vampire coming for their living family members. When a corpse was exhumed, their bloated dead body could appear as a vampire who had recently fed. A corpse with a stake driven through its heart could also emit something that sounded like a scream, but was really just the escape of natural gases, another normal product of decomposition. And social ties also played a role in these rituals. People like George Brown may have felt pressure from their neighbors, friends, and peers to do something, anything, to help fix the problem. And even if these rituals didn't work, family members couldn't just sit still and watch their loved ones waste away to this mysterious illness. But what about other stories? The Corwin child, who still had blood in his heart months after death. Or Lena Brown, whose body remained in pristine condition while her mother and sister were fully decayed. As it turns out, there are some holes in these stories too. There's one thing that's really important to remember. The case of JB, who I've talked about at the beginning of this video, is the only case here with physical evidence of anti-vampire rituals. All the other cases are recounted from eyewitness writings or from newspaper articles at the time. We only know about Frederick Ransom through his brother, who was just 3 years old when Frederick died and didn't write down his account until over 75 years after it happened. In the case of the Corwin vampire, nobody with that last name who died at that time has been found in the cemetery connected to the story. There are no newspaper accounts from the time of the elaborate ritual that supposedly took place, a ritual that would have drawn a crowd. This particular story is thought to be more of a legend than an accurate retelling. And what about Lena Brown? Remember, she died in January in Rhode Island, and it was cold. She was exhumed just a couple of months after her death, leaving her very little time to decay in the frigidity of the New England winter. It makes sense that her corpse would still be largely preserved in those circumstances. And in the case of another alleged vampire, Nellie Vaughn, there are no actual accounts suggesting she was a suspected vampire. She also died of pneumonia, unlike most other people on this list. It's thought she was simply mixed up with Lena Brown. It's also possible that the epitaph on Simon Whipple Aldrich's grave is the only reason he was ever brought into the vampire conversation. The vampire inscription could very well be metaphorical, and the word consumption was also used at the time for tuberculosis. These two cases remind me a bit of Midnight Mary, which I made a video on a couple of years ago. I will link that video down below in the description. After Lena Brown's case, the vampire panic started to wane. Vampires briefly re-entered the news cycle in the 1970s with the case of the Highgate vampire, which I also did a video on. As I stated in that video, that case was more a story of mass hysteria rather than actual vampire lore. Today, vampires are largely considered the stuff of legend. In 2019, new DNA testing revealed JB was likely a farmer named John Barber. In 2022, a facial reconstruction was released showing what he may have looked like in life. In a time where most people see vampires as largely fictional, it's pretty interesting to look back and see how afraid people were of them just a little over a century ago. Some of these rituals and fears might seem strange to us. However, I would encourage you not to judge these people too harshly. Most of them were probably doing the best they could with the information they had, just like we are. Thanks for watching, and have a creepy day.